I gave my daughter everything, including the deed to my family home when she married him. 3 months later, he handed me a schedule for cleaning duties and pointed to the basement room where the help used to sleep. I didn't argue. I didn't fight back. I moved my things downstairs and started planning his complete destruction. By Christmas, I was handing him eviction papers wrapped in a bow, and my daughter finally saw who she'd really married. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marie Campbell, and I built my life believing that family comes first, always. For 62 years, I lived by that rule without question. I raised my daughter Sarah as a single mother, after her father walked out when she was 7. I worked double shifts at the textile mill, saved every penny I could scrape together, and put her through college without a single student loan. When she graduated with her business degree, I was the proudest mother in that auditorium, crying behind my cheap sunglasses because I knew all those sleepless nights had been worth it. The house I'm talking about isn't just any house. It's a Victorian manor that belonged to my grandmother, passed down through 4 generations of Campbell women. 12 rooms, wraparound porch, original hardwood floors, and a garden that took me 30 years to perfect. The property sits on 3 acres in Millbrook Heights, the kind of neighborhood where old money whispers behind manicured hedges. I never belonged there financially, but the house was mine by blood, and I spent decades maintaining it on a mill worker's salary, because letting it fall apart would have dishonored every woman who came before me. Sarah met Derek Whitman at a corporate networking event 2 years ago. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a leased BMW, and wore suits that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. When she brought him home for the first time, he walked through my house like he was conducting an appraisal, commenting on the crown molding and asking pointed questions about property taxes. I should have seen the red flags then, but Sarah was glowing in a way I'd never seen before. She'd been single for 3 years after a bad breakup, and Derek seemed to worship the ground she walked on. Their engagement was a whirlwind. He proposed after 8 months with a ring that must have cost him 6 months' salary, and Sarah called me at midnight, sobbing with happiness. The wedding planning consumed her completely. She quit her marketing job to focus on becoming the perfect wife, something that worried me, but I kept my mouth shut. Derek insisted on paying for everything: the venue, the dress, the honeymoon to Italy. He wanted to show the world that his bride deserved the finest things in life. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sarah came to me with tears in her eyes and a proposal that made my stomach drop. Derek's lease was ending, and they needed somewhere to live while house hunting. Could they stay with me temporarily, just until they found the perfect place? Of course, I said yes. What mother wouldn't? But then came the second part. Derek had been researching the neighborhood, and he'd discovered that my property was worth significantly more than I realized. Houses in Millbrook Heights were selling for $800,000 or more. Mine, with its historical significance and pristine condition, could easily be worth over $1 million. He'd also learned that I was struggling financially. The property taxes had doubled in the past 5 years due to gentrification, and my mill pension barely covered them, plus basic maintenance. The roof needed work, the heating system was ancient, and I'd been putting off repairs because I couldn't afford them. Derek proposed a solution that seemed too good to be true. If I transferred the deed to Sarah, they could take out a mortgage against the property to pay for renovations and cover the ongoing expenses. I would continue living there rent-free for the rest of my life, but the financial burden would be lifted from my shoulders. Sarah begged me to consider it. She painted a picture of us all living together like a real family, sharing holidays and Sunday dinners, maybe even grandchildren playing in the garden someday. Derek nodded along, calling me Mom and talking about how he'd always wanted to preserve historical properties. He showed me spreadsheets proving how the arrangement would benefit everyone. I would have security, they would have a beautiful home, and the Campbell legacy would continue. I signed the papers 2 days before the wedding. Derek had arranged everything through his real estate connections, expedited the process, and handled all the legal fees as his wedding gift to me. Sarah cried when I handed her the deed, saying it was the most generous thing anyone had ever done for her. I felt good about it, proud even. I was giving my daughter the security I'd never had, ensuring she'd always have a roof over her head, no matter what life threw at her. The wedding was everything Sarah had dreamed of. She looked like a princess in her pearl-beaded gown, and Derek couldn't stop smiling as they exchanged vows in the garden of what was now their home. I hosted the reception on the back lawn, my roses in full bloom, the string quartet playing under the gazebo my grandfather had built in 1952. 200 guests danced until midnight, and I felt like the luckiest mother in the world watching my daughter begin her fairy tale life. The first month after the honeymoon was blissful. Derek was charm personified, bringing me flowers every Friday and insisting on taking us both out to dinner at expensive restaurants. He praised my cooking, complimented my gardening skills, and talked about his big plans for the property. He wanted to restore the original carriage house, update the kitchen with period-appropriate fixtures, and maybe even add a swimming pool behind the rose garden. Sarah was radiant, playing house in the home where she'd grown up, rearranging furniture and redecorating rooms to reflect her new married status. I should have noticed the subtle changes earlier. Derek started asking detailed questions about my daily routine, when I went to bed, when I woke up, which rooms I used most frequently. He began commenting on things that had never been issues before. The guest bathroom I'd been using was right next to the master suite, and he mentioned that the walls were thin, that he could hear me moving around in the mornings. My television in the living room was apparently too loud during his work-from-home calls. The garden tools I kept on the back porch were cluttering up the space they wanted to use for entertaining. Sarah seemed oblivious to these complaints, or maybe she was choosing to ignore them. She'd become obsessed with being the perfect wife, spending hours preparing elaborate meals and keeping the house spotless. When I offered to help with cleaning or cooking, she'd brush me off, saying Derek liked things done a certain way. I started feeling like a guest in my own home, tiptoeing around their schedule and trying to make myself invisible during their dinner parties and weekend entertaining. The real shift happened at the end of the second month. Derek came to me with a serious expression and a folder full of documents. He'd been researching the house's history, he said, and he discovered something interesting. The basement level had originally been designed as servant quarters back when the house was built in 1889. There was a separate entrance, a small bedroom, a bathroom, and even a kitchenette that had been sealed off decades ago. He'd had contractors come look at it while I was at my weekly grocery shopping, and they'd confirmed that the space could be easily restored to its original purpose. He presented this discovery as an exciting opportunity for everyone. I could have my own private apartment downstairs, complete independence and privacy, while they had the main floors for their married life. It would be like having my own small house within the bigger house, he explained. Perfect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For someone my age who might appreciate not having to climb stairs every day, the contractors could have it ready in 2 weeks, and Derek would personally oversee every detail to ensure it met my needs. Sarah was enthusiastic about the idea when Derek presented it to her. She talked about how nice it would be for me to have my own space, how I could decorate however I wanted without worrying about their modern aesthetic preferences. She mentioned that they were planning to start a family soon, and wouldn't it be wonderful if I had a quiet retreat where I could help with the baby without feeling like I was in the way? Derek nodded along, adding that the arrangement would give me the privacy every mature woman deserved while still keeping me close to family. I felt sick listening to them discuss my living situation like I wasn't in the room, but what could I say? The house was legally theirs now. I had no mortgage payments, no property taxes, no repair bills. They were offering to spend thousands of dollars creating a beautiful apartment for me at no cost. On paper, it was generous. In reality, it felt like I was being moved to the servants' quarters of my own family home. The renovation happened with stunning efficiency. Derek supervised everything personally, ensuring the contractors worked quickly and quietly. The basement apartment was beautiful when they finished, I had to admit. Hardwood floors, updated plumbing, a small but modern kitchen, and French doors that opened to a private patio in the back garden. Derek had even installed a separate entrance so I could come and go without disturbing them upstairs. The bedroom was cozy, with built-in shelving and a window that looked out on my rose garden. Moving my belongings downstairs felt like a funeral. 62 years of memories packed into boxes and relocated to a space that measured less than 600 square feet. My grandmother's china went into a small cabinet. My mother's jewelry box sat on a narrow dresser. The quilt my great-grandmother had sewn by hand was folded at the foot of a bed that wasn't mine in a room that used to house people who were paid to serve my family. Derek and Sarah helped me move, both of them chattering about how perfect everything looked, how lucky I was to have such a beautiful private space. Derek kept pointing out features the contractors had added: the heated floors, the extra insulation, the security system that would keep me safe. Sarah arranged flowers in a vase on my new kitchen counter and hung my favorite paintings on the walls. They were trying so hard to make it seem like a blessing that I almost convinced myself it was. The first week in the basement wasn't terrible. I had my own space, my own schedule, and the freedom to watch television or listen to music without worrying about disturbing anyone. Derek and Sarah would text me before coming downstairs, treating my new apartment like an actual separate residence. We still had Sunday dinner together in the main dining room, and Sarah would invite me up for coffee in the mornings before Derek left for work. But gradually, the dynamic shifted in ways that made my skin crawl. Derek started referring to the upstairs as the house, and my space as the apartment, as if we lived in two different buildings. When friends came to visit, I was introduced as Sarah's mother who lived in the basement apartment, not as the woman who'd owned the house for 30 years. Derek would joke about how convenient it was to have built-in childcare when they started having babies, and how I'd be right there to help with household tasks since I had so much free time. The household tasks comment should have been my first real warning, but I missed it in the moment. Derek had a way of making suggestions sound like casual observations, planting seeds that would bloom into demands later. He mentioned that the main house felt different now that it was just him and Sarah, more peaceful, more focused on their future together. He talked about how hard Sarah worked to keep everything perfect for him, how exhausted she was trying to maintain such a large house while also being a good wife. 3 months after I moved to the basement, Derek knocked on my door with a manila folder and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had a proposition, he said. Another opportunity for our family arrangement to work even better for everyone involved. Sarah was overwhelmed trying to manage the house while also planning their future, and Derek had been thinking about solutions that would help her while also giving me a sense of purpose in my new living situation. He opened the folder and pulled out a typed document with the header, Household Management Schedule. It was a detailed list of daily, weekly, and monthly tasks required to maintain the property, from vacuuming and dusting to laundry and meal preparation. Each task was assigned specific time slots and detailed instructions for completion standards. At the bottom of the page was a schedule showing when I would be expected to complete each responsibility. Derek explained that since I was living rent-free in a beautiful apartment, it only made sense for me to contribute to the household in other ways. Sarah was delicate, he said, not used to the physical demands of maintaining such a large property. I, on the other hand, had been doing this work for decades and clearly knew the house better than anyone. This arrangement would allow Sarah to focus on being a good wife while I maintained the home that had been in my family for generations. I stared at the document, reading through tasks that included cleaning 4 bathrooms, maintaining 12 rooms, preparing meals for their dinner parties, and doing their personal laundry. The schedule showed me working 6 days a week, with Sundays free for family time. There was a section about dress code for when guests were present, suggesting I wear simple, dark clothing and avoid wearing jewelry or makeup that might seem inappropriate for my role. The word role stuck in my throat like a bone. Derek was asking me to become the hired help in my own family home, to clean toilets and scrub floors and serve dinner to people who would never know that I'd once owned every brick and board of the house they were admiring. He was asking me to become invisible, a shadow moving through rooms that had been filled with my laughter and tears and dreams for 62 years. When I didn't respond immediately, Derek's tone shifted slightly. He reminded me that property taxes were due soon, that the heating system needed maintenance, that the roof repair couldn't be delayed much longer. All of these expenses were now his responsibility, he said, and they were adding up to more than he'd anticipated. If I wasn't able to contribute to the household through labor, he might have to reconsider the financial arrangement we'd made. Perhaps I could find a small apartment in town, something more suitable for someone on a fixed income. The threat was delivered with a smile, wrapped in concern for my well-being, but it was unmistakably a threat. I could either accept my new role as unpaid domestic staff, Or I could be homeless at 62, with nothing but my pension and whatever possessions I could carry. Derek had planned this carefully, waiting until the property transfer was complete and irreversible before revealing his true intentions. I took the folder and told him I needed time to think about it. He nodded graciously, saying he understood that change could be difficult at my age, but he was confident I'd see the wisdom in his proposal. He reminded me that family had to make sacrifices for each other, and that this arrangement would allow us all to live together harmoniously for years to come. That night, I sat in my basement apartment reading through the household management schedule by lamplight, feeling more alone than I had since my mother died 15 years earlier. Derek had reduced me to a servant in my own home, and he'd done it so smoothly that even Sarah seemed to think it was reasonable. When I tried to talk to her about it the next morning, she was distracted and dismissive, saying that Derek always had the best ideas for making things work for everyone. I realized, being a good wife. 3 months after I moved to the basement, Derek knocked on my door with a manila folder and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had a proposition, he said. Another opportunity for our family arrangement to work even better for everyone involved. Sarah was overwhelmed trying to manage the house while also planning their future, and Derek had been thinking about solutions that would help her, while also giving me a sense of purpose in my new living situation. He opened the folder and pulled out a typed document with the header, Household Management Schedule. It was a detailed list of daily, weekly, and monthly tasks required to maintain the property, from vacuuming and dusting to laundry and meal preparation. Each task was assigned specific time slots and detailed instructions for completion standards. At the bottom of the page was a schedule showing when I would be expected to complete each responsibility. Derek explained that since I was living rent-free in a beautiful apartment, it only made sense for me to contribute to the household in other ways. Sarah was delicate, he said, not used to the physical demands of maintaining such a large property. I, on the other hand, had been doing this work for decades and clearly knew the house better than anyone. This arrangement would allow Sarah to focus on being a good wife while I maintained the home that had been in my family for generations. I stared at the document, reading through tasks that included cleaning 4 bathrooms, maintaining 12 rooms, preparing meals for their dinner parties, and doing their personal laundry. The schedule showed me working 6 days a week, with Sundays free for family time. There was a section about dress code for when guests were present, suggesting I wear simple, dark clothing and avoid wearing jewelry or makeup that might seem inappropriate for my role. The word role stuck in my throat like a bone. Derek was asking me to become the hired help in my own family home, to clean toilets and scrub floors and serve dinner to people who would never know that I'd once owned every brick and board of the house they were admiring. He was asking me to become invisible, a shadow moving through rooms that had been filled with my laughter and tears and dreams for 62 years. When I didn't respond immediately, Derek's tone shifted slightly. He reminded me that property taxes were due soon, that the heating system needed maintenance, that the roof repair couldn't be delayed much longer. All of these expenses were now his responsibility, he said, and they were adding up to more than he'd anticipated. If I wasn't able to contribute to the household through labor, he might have to reconsider the financial arrangement we'd made. Perhaps I could find a small apartment in town, something more suitable for someone on a fixed income. The threat was delivered with a smile, wrapped in concern for my well-being, but it was unmistakably a threat. I could either accept my new role as unpaid domestic staff, or I could be homeless at 62 with nothing but my pension and whatever possessions I could carry. Derek had planned this carefully, waiting until the property transfer was complete and irreversible before revealing his true intentions. I took the folder and told him I needed time to think about it. He nodded graciously, saying he understood that change could be difficult at my age, but he was confident I'd see the wisdom in his proposal. He reminded me that family had to make sacrifices for each other, and that this arrangement would allow us all to live together harmoniously for years to come. That night, I sat in my basement apartment reading through the household management schedule by lamplight, feeling more alone than I had since my mother died 15 years earlier. Derek had reduced me to a servant in my own home, and he'd done it so smoothly that even Sarah seemed to think it was reasonable. When I tried to talk to her about it the next morning, she was distracted and dismissive, saying that Derek always had the best ideas for making things work for everyone. I realized, drowning in debt, his BMW was leased, not owned. His expensive suits were charged to credit cards that were already maxed out. The renovation of my basement apartment had been paid for with a second mortgage on my house, a loan Derek had taken out without mentioning it to Sarah. Derek wasn't just using my house as a place to live rent-free. He was using it as collateral for a lifestyle he couldn't afford, borrowing against the property value to fund his expensive tastes and questionable investments. I started photographing documents when I was alone in his study, building a file of evidence that painted a picture of financial recklessness and deliberate deception. The deeper I dug, the more I discovered about Derek's pattern of behavior. This wasn't his first time targeting a vulnerable woman for financial gain. I found business cards from divorce attorneys, notes about previous relationships with older women who owned property, and emails discussing strategies for asset protection that made my blood run cold. Derek was a professional predator, and I'd handed him everything he needed to destroy my family's legacy. But knowledge without power is just frustration, and Derek held all the legal cards. The house was in Sarah's name, but she was completely under his influence. She'd given up her career, isolated herself from old friends, and become financially dependent on him for everything from grocery money to health insurance. Even if I could prove Derek was a fraud, Sarah might not believe me, and confronting him directly would only result in my immediate eviction. I needed a strategy that would expose Derek's true nature while protecting Sarah and giving me legal recourse to reclaim my property. That meant I had to think like Derek, find his weaknesses, and use his own methods against him. I'd spent 3 months learning to be invisible in my own home. Now I needed to use that invisibility as a weapon. The opportunity came during Derek's monthly dinner party for his business associates. These events were always elaborate affairs, with catered food, expensive wine, and important people from the local real estate community. Derek loved showing off the house during these parties, giving tours and telling stories about the property's history as if he were a longtime resident instead of a recent interloper. I was expected to serve drinks and clean up during these events, moving silently through rooms full of people who treated me like part of the furniture. But this particular evening, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Derek was talking to a potential business partner about a development deal, mentioning that he had access to significant collateral through family property that could be leveraged for investment purposes. He was planning to mortgage my house again, this time to fund a commercial real estate venture that sounded risky at best and fraudulent at worst. The partner was asking pointed questions about Derek's authority to make such decisions, and Derek was lying smoothly about his legal relationship to the property. He claimed to be the primary owner, with Sarah as a silent partner, and me as a tenant who could be relocated if necessary for business purposes. That night, after cleaning up champagne glasses and disposing of evidence of Derek's financial planning, I sat in my basement apartment and realized I'd found my weapon. Derek's arrogance would be his downfall. He'd gotten so comfortable with his deception that he was discussing illegal activity in front of witnesses, including the woman he'd stolen from. All I needed was proof of his plans and evidence that he was misrepresenting his legal authority over the property. I started recording conversations using a small digital device I'd purchased with my pension money. I photographed every document I could access, building a comprehensive file of Derek's financial crimes and marriage fraud. I researched property law and discovered that while Sarah owned the house, she'd never been properly informed about the mortgages Derek had taken out against it. These loans might be challengeable if I could prove he'd acted without her knowledge or consent. Most importantly, I reached out to an old friend whose son had become a successful attorney specializing in elder fraud and financial abuse. When I explained my situation, he agreed to meet with me quietly to review the evidence I'd gathered. The consultation revealed that Derek had made several serious legal mistakes, including forging signatures on loan documents and misrepresenting his authority to lenders. The attorney's advice was clear. I had grounds for both criminal charges and civil action, but timing would be crucial. Derek was already planning his next fraudulent loan, which would give me the evidence I needed to prove ongoing criminal activity. I just had to be patient, continue playing the role of harmless elderly servant, and wait for Derek to hang himself with his own rope. 3 weeks later, Derek made his final mistake. He brought the loan documents home for Sarah to sign, presenting them as simple refinancing paperwork that would lower their monthly payments. Sarah trusted him completely and was ready to sign without reading, but I was dusting nearby and managed to photograph the papers before Derek locked them in his study. The documents showed Derek attempting to take out a $600,000 loan against the property, with Sarah listed as co-signer but Derek claiming primary authority as head of household. The money was designated for a business investment that didn't exist, with repayment terms that would have forced the sale of the house within 2 years. I had everything I needed. That evening, I called my attorney friend and arranged for an emergency meeting the next morning. By noon, we had filed formal complaints with the police, the district attorney's office, and the state banking commission. We also prepared civil papers to challenge the validity of the property transfer and freeze all existing mortgages pending investigation. Derek's world started unraveling on a Tuesday morning in November. He came home from his morning meeting with potential investors to find police cars in the driveway, and detectives waiting to speak with him about multiple counts of financial fraud. Sarah was hysterical, completely blindsided by the revelation that her husband had been borrowing against her house without her knowledge. I watched from my basement window as Derek was led away in handcuffs, still wearing the expensive suit I'd pressed for him that morning. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd been literally cleaning up after a criminal while he'd been planning to steal my family's home for the second time. The legal proceedings moved quickly once Derek's other victims started coming forward. Apparently, I wasn't his first target, just his most successful one. The pattern of behavior was clear. Find vulnerable women with valuable property, charm his way into their lives, gain legal control of their assets, and then exploit those assets for personal gain, while reducing the women to dependent servants in their own homes. Sarah was devastated when the full scope of Derek's deception became clear. She genuinely loved him, believed in their future together, and trusted him with decisions that had put both of us at risk. The divorce papers were filed within a week, and Sarah moved back into the basement apartment with me while the legal mess got sorted out. It took 6 months to untangle Derek's financial crimes and restore the property to its rightful status. The mortgages he'd taken out were declared fraudulent and dismissed. The basement apartment was converted back to storage space, and Sarah and I began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship and our trust in each other. Derek was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for financial fraud, with additional time for elder abuse and identity theft related to his other victims. The house was returned to my name with Sarah as the designated heir, but this time with legal protections that would prevent anyone from manipulating either of us in the future. On Christmas morning, exactly 1 year after Derek had first handed me that household management schedule, I woke up in my own bedroom on the second floor of my family home. Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee, and we were planning to spend the day decorating the house for the first real Christmas we'd had together in years. I never did serve Derek those eviction papers wrapped in a bow like I'd planned. By the time Christmas came around, he was in federal custody, and eviction papers seemed unnecessary. Instead, I wrapped up the original deed to the house, the one my great-grandmother had signed in 1889, and gave it to Sarah as a reminder that our family's legacy was stronger than any man's attempts to steal it. The servants' quarters in the basement remain empty now, a reminder of how close we came to losing everything to someone who saw kindness as weakness and trust as opportunity. But they also remind me that sometimes you have to let people think they've won before you can show them how completely they've lost. Derek thought he could turn me into a servant in my own home. Instead, he taught me that the most powerful position in any house is the one that sees everything, hears everything, and never stops planning for justice. Some people call it revenge. I call it education. Either way, it's a lesson Derek will have 5 years to think about. The morning Derek handed me that household management schedule marked the beginning of what I now understand was psychological warfare disguised as family cooperation. He'd spent months studying my routines, my weaknesses, and my deep-seated need to be useful to the people I loved. The document wasn't just a list of chores, it was a carefully crafted tool designed to strip away my identity and replace it with the role of grateful domestic help. I should have thrown the folder back in his face and demanded he explain why the woman who'd raised his wife and owned this house for 3 decades should suddenly become his unpaid employee. Instead, I found myself reading through each task with the same attention I'd once given to Sarah's homework assignments. Derek had a gift for making the unreasonable sound logical, for framing exploitation as opportunity. The schedule began at 5:30 each morning with preparation of Derek's coffee, exactly 3 scoops of imported Colombian beans, water heated to 190 degrees, served in the white ceramic mug he'd designated as his favorite. This was followed by preparation of Sarah's breakfast tray, complete with fresh orange juice, whole grain toast cut diagonally, and whatever seasonal fruit looked best at the market. The tray was to be delivered to their bedroom at precisely 7:15, accompanied by the morning newspaper and any mail that had arrived the previous day. By 8 o'clock, I was expected to have both beds made according to specific instructions that Derek had typed out in excruciating detail. The sheets were to be pulled tight enough to bounce a quarter, pillows fluffed and arranged at exact angles, and the throw pillows on their bed positioned according to a diagram he'd included in the folder. The master bathroom required daily attention that included scrubbing the shower, cleaning mirrors to streak-free perfection, and restocking towels that had to be folded in thirds and arranged with labels facing inward. The kitchen duties alone would have constituted a full-time job. Every surface was to be wiped down with specific cleaning products that Derek had researched and ordered online. The refrigerator needed weekly organization, with items arranged by expiration date and type. The pantry required monthly inventory, with a written list submitted to Derek for approval before any grocery shopping could begin. Even the garbage disposal had a maintenance schedule that included weekly grinding of ice cubes and lemon peels to keep it fresh and functional. Derek had assigned specific days for different rooms throughout the house. Mondays were for the living areas, which meant dusting every surface, vacuuming carpets, mopping hardwood floors, and cleaning windows inside and out. Tuesdays were designated for bathrooms, all 4 of them, each requiring the same level of attention I'd once reserved for spring cleaning. Wednesdays meant bedrooms and closets, which involved not just cleaning but organizing Derek's extensive wardrobe according to color and season. Thursdays were perhaps the most insulting assignment of all, designated as laundry day. Derek's shirts required hand washing and professional pressing, a skill I'd learned decades ago but never imagined I'd be using to serve my daughter's husband. His suits needed careful brushing and proper storage in garment bags between wearings. Even his underwear and socks required specific folding techniques that he'd apparently learned from some luxury hotel management program. Fridays were reserved for kitchen deep cleaning and meal preparation for weekend entertaining. Derek and Sarah had developed an active social life that involved dinner parties, wine tastings, and networking events that showcased their beautiful historic home. I was expected to prepare elaborate meals for these gatherings, serve drinks during the evening, and clean up afterward while the guests moved to the living room for coffee and conversation. The weekend schedule was somewhat lighter, with Saturday designated for outdoor maintenance and Sunday supposedly free except for family dinner preparation. But Derek's definition of outdoor maintenance included gardening tasks that had taken me years to master, plus cleaning the carriage house, maintaining the 3-car garage, and keeping the wraparound porch spotless for unexpected visitors who might stop by to admire the property. What made the whole arrangement particularly degrading was Derek's insistence on regular performance reviews. Every Friday evening, he would sit me down in the kitchen and go through a checklist of the week's accomplishments, noting areas where my work had met his standards and others where improvement was needed. These sessions were conducted with the same tone a corporate manager might use with an underperforming employee, complete with written documentation that he filed away in a folder marked Household Staff Performance. The performance reviews revealed Derek's true nature in ways that his charming public persona never could. He criticized everything from my cleaning techniques to my personal appearance, suggesting that I needed to maintain a more professional demeanor when guests were present. He complained about the speed with which I completed tasks, implying that someone with my experience should be more efficient. Most humiliatingly, he began timing certain activities, setting stopwatches to measure how long it took me to clean a bathroom or prepare a meal. Sarah's transformation during this period was almost as disturbing as Derek's behavior. The daughter who had once helped me with household chores without being asked now walked past me while I was scrubbing floors as if I were invisible. She'd developed a habit of leaving messes in her wake, dropping clothes on bedroom floors, and leaving dishes on coffee tables, with the casual assumption that someone else would handle the cleanup. When friends came to visit, Sarah would introduce me as the help, or simply as Marie, without any mention of our family relationship. I watched her serve tea to college friends in the living room where I'd once taught her to play piano, while I was expected to remain in the kitchen preparing refreshments and staying out of sight unless specifically summoned. The girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms was now embarrassed by my presence in spaces she considered exclusively hers. Derek encouraged this behavior with subtle comments about appropriate boundaries between family members and household staff. He'd mention how refreshing it was that Sarah understood the importance of maintaining professional relationships with service providers, even when those providers happened to be relatives. He praised her for learning to delegate household responsibilities, calling it a sign of maturity and proper family leadership. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of my new role. Derek had effectively severed my connection to the community I'd been part of for 6 decades. My weekly bridge game with neighbors was discontinued because Derek needed me available for unexpected tasks. My volunteer work at the local food bank was suspended because my household duties required consistent availability. Even my longtime friendship with Janet Morrison, who lived 2 streets over, began to fade because I was never free for coffee dates or spontaneous visits. Derek had also restricted my access to certain areas of the house during specific times. The living room was off-limits during his work-from-home hours, which seemed to expand weekly as his real estate business demanded more attention. The master bedroom was forbidden territory except during designated cleaning times, and even then I was expected to complete my tasks quickly and leave without lingering. The study, where Derek conducted his business calls and managed his financial affairs, was completely off-limits, except for weekly dusting that had to be scheduled in advance. These restrictions meant that I was essentially confined to the basement apartment, the kitchen, and whatever room I happened to be cleaning at any given moment. I felt like a ghost in my own home, moving through spaces that held decades of memories while being treated as if I had no legitimate claim to be there. The house that had once been filled with my laughter and Sarah's childhood joy had become a workplace where I was expected to remain invisible unless specifically needed. The financial manipulation was perhaps even more insidious than the household servitude. Derek had taken complete control over all property-related expenses, from utility bills to insurance payments. He'd established a system where I had to request permission for any personal purchases beyond basic groceries, requiring written justification for expenses as small as a new pair of shoes or a birthday gift for an old friend. My pension checks were now deposited into a joint account that Derek managed, ostensibly to simplify household budgeting but actually to monitor and control my spending. He'd set up automatic transfers for what he called household contribution payments, deducting money from my pension to cover my share of utilities, property taxes, and maintenance costs. The remaining amount was deposited into a smaller account that he'd opened for my personal expenses, with monthly statements that he reviewed and questioned. This financial surveillance extended to every aspect of my daily life. Derek required receipts for all purchases, which he filed away in the same folder as my performance reviews. He'd question expenditures that he considered unnecessary or excessive, suggesting alternative products or stores that might offer better value. When I purchased a new winter coat to replace one that had worn out after 15 years, Derek spent 20 minutes explaining how I could have saved money by shopping at discount retailers instead of the department store where I'd shopped for decades. The psychological impact of this treatment was cumulative and devastating. I'd gone from being the respected matriarch of my family to being treated like a wayward employee who needed constant supervision and correction. Derek's criticism was constant but delivered in tones of helpful concern, making it difficult to object without seeming ungrateful or unreasonable. He had a talent for making me feel like I was failing at tasks I'd performed successfully for decades. Sleep became elusive as I lay in my basement bedroom thinking about tasks I'd completed incorrectly or criticism Derek had offered during the day. I'd find myself rehearsing conversations where I explained my perspective or defended my methods, but these imaginary discussions never translated into real confrontations. Derek's control was so complete and his manipulation so subtle that I couldn't identify specific moments when I should have fought back. The breaking point came during a dinner party Derek organized for potential business partners in early December. 24 guests were expected for a formal meal that required days of preparation, from menu planning to table setting to coordinating serving times with multiple courses. Derek had hired a catering company to handle the main dishes, but I was responsible for appetizers, wine service, and coordination between the kitchen and dining room throughout the evening. The guest list included several prominent local business leaders, a city council member, and the president of the Historical Society who had known my family for decades. Mrs. Hamilton from the Historical Society had visited our home many times over the years, had interviewed my grandmother about the house's history, and had even featured our property in a published tour guide of historic Millbrook Heights homes. As guests began arriving that evening, I was stationed in the kitchen wearing the black dress and white apron that Derek had purchased for formal occasions. The outfit was clearly intended to mark me as hired help, distinguishing me from family members and ensuring that guests understood my role in the household. Derek had even provided a small name tag that read Marie Household Staff, which he insisted I wear during the cocktail hour. The evening began smoothly enough, with guests arriving promptly and gathering in the living room for drinks and appetizers. Derek played the perfect host, guiding tours through the main floor rooms and sharing stories about the house's architecture and historical significance. Sarah looked stunning in a cocktail dress that cost more than my monthly pension, greeting guests with the confidence of someone born to entertain in elegant surroundings. I moved silently through the gathering, refilling wine glasses and passing trays of appetizers while Derek gestured grandly about restoration projects and future plans for the property. He'd developed a narrative about his role as caretaker of this historic home, describing his commitment to preserving architectural details and maintaining the property's character for future generations. Guests nodded appreciatively as he explained the challenges and rewards of owning such a significant piece of local history. Mrs. Hamilton was among the first to arrive, and I felt a surge of hope when she greeted me warmly in the kitchen while I was arranging canapes on silver trays. She'd known me since Sarah was a baby, had visited regularly over the years, and had always treated me with the respect due to a longtime community member. Surely she would notice something wrong with my current situation, would ask questions that might expose Derek's manipulation. But when Mrs. Hamilton asked about my role in the household, Derek smoothly intervened with an explanation that left me speechless. He described how fortunate they were to have someone with my experience managing the household operations, emphasizing my years of familiarity with the property and my commitment to maintaining family traditions. He made it sound like I'd chosen this arrangement, like I was a valued employee rather than a displaced homeowner. Mrs. Hamilton seemed satisfied with this explanation, complimenting Derek on his wisdom in retaining someone who understood the house's unique requirements. She even praised him for providing employment opportunities for older community members, describing it as a wonderful example of intergenerational cooperation. I stood there holding a tray of shrimp cocktail, while someone who'd known me for 30 years discussed me as if I were Derek's charitable project. The dinner service was flawless from a logistical perspective, but devastating from an emotional one. I served multiple courses to people who had once been my social equals, including several women who had attended my holiday parties in this same dining room when I was the hostess rather than the help. They smiled politely when I refilled their water glasses or cleared their plates, but none of them seemed to recognize the fundamental wrongness of my situation. Derek had positioned himself at the head of my grandmother's dining table, using her china and silverware to entertain guests in the room where 4 generations of Campbell women had celebrated holidays and special occasions. He told stories about the house's history with authority and possessiveness, claiming intimate knowledge of family traditions and architectural details as if he'd inherited them rather than stolen them through legal manipulation. The most painful moment came when one of the guests asked about family photographs displayed on the mantelpiece, including pictures of my parents and grandparents who had lived in this house before me. Derek discussed them as if they were previous owners whose legacy he was honored to continue, making no mention of the fact that their descendant was currently serving his dinner in a uniform he'd selected for her. After the last guest departed and the final dish was washed, I stood alone in the kitchen that had been the heart of my family's life for over a century. The room still smelled like my grandmother's lavender sachets, still bore the scorch mark from the time my mother had left a potholder too close to the stove, still held memories of teaching Sarah to bake cookies on snowy Saturday afternoons. But now it was Derek's kitchen, in Derek's house where I worked as Derek's employee under terms he dictated without consultation or negotiation. I'd been erased from my own life so completely that people who'd known me for decades now saw me as nothing more than well-trained household staff who happened to share some family connection to the property's history. That night, lying in my basement bedroom listening to Derek and Sarah discussing the evening's success in the room directly above me, I realized that my situation was even worse than I'd initially understood. Derek hadn't just stolen my house and reduced me to servant status. He'd rewritten my entire identity, transforming me from respected community member to anonymous domestic worker, whose presence was tolerated only as long as it served his purposes. The conversation I overheard through the thin ceiling revealed Derek's future plans with devastating clarity. He was discussing the evening's networking success with Sarah, particularly the connections he'd made with potential investment partners who'd been impressed by the house and his apparent financial stability. He mentioned specific dollar amounts that could be borrowed against the property value, describing schemes that would fund business ventures while maintaining the facade of family prosperity. Sarah's responses were minimal, mostly agreeable murmurs that suggested she wasn't fully understanding the implications of Derek's financial planning. She seemed satisfied that the evening had been socially successful, that their guests had been appropriately impressed by their home and hospitality. She had no idea that Derek was using her inheritance as collateral for business deals that could result in losing everything our family had built over 4 generations. As I lay there listening to my daughter's husband plan the next phase of his exploitation, I realized that my transformation from homeowner to servant had been just the first step in a larger scheme. Derek intended to use my house not just as a free place to live, but as a tool for generating wealth that would fund a lifestyle completely beyond his actual means. He was treating my family's legacy like a renewable resource that could be harvested indefinitely without consequence. The knowledge that Derek was planning to mortgage my house again, this time for business investments rather than property improvements, finally crystallized my determination to fight back. I had accepted the role of household servant because I thought it was the price of keeping my family together and maintaining some connection to my ancestral home. But Derek's plans went far beyond domestic humiliation. He intended to destroy everything my family had built, and he was using me as unpaid labor while he orchestrated that destruction. The next morning, I began my new dual existence as Derek's servant and his secret investigator. While I continued to follow the household management schedule he'd created, I also started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. Phone conversations that had once been background noise became opportunities to gather intelligence. Documents left on his desk during cleaning became sources of crucial information about his business dealings and financial obligations. Derek's confidence in his complete control over my life worked to my advantage in ways he never could have anticipated. He'd become so comfortable with my presence that he'd stopped moderating his behavior or concealing his activities. He took calls about questionable business deals while I was vacuuming nearby, assuming I was too focused on my work to pay attention. He left important papers unsecured in his study, confident that his household servant wouldn't understand their significance or have any reason to examine them closely. What Derek didn't know was that I'd spent 40 years working in the administrative offices of the textile mill before my retirement, handling payroll, insurance claims, and union grievances that required careful attention to legal documents and financial details. I understood contracts, loan applications, and business correspondence better than he realized. His assumption that age and domestic service had rendered me intellectually harmless was about to become his most expensive mistake. The evidence I began collecting painted a picture of systematic fraud that extended far beyond my personal situation. Derek had a pattern of targeting older women with valuable property, gaining their trust through romantic relationships with their daughters or relatives, and then manipulating legal arrangements to gain control over assets he could exploit for personal gain. My house was just his latest target in a scheme that had apparently been successful multiple times before. As December progressed and Derek's plans for additional borrowing against my property became more concrete, I realized that time was running short. He was moving quickly to complete deals that would generate immediate cash, while creating long-term obligations that would eventually force the sale of my family home. If I was going to stop him, I needed to act before those transactions became legally binding and financially irreversible. The challenge was building a strong enough case to convince authorities that Derek's actions constituted fraud, rather than legitimate business activities conducted with appropriate family consent. Sarah's signature on documents would complicate any legal challenge, especially since she appeared to be cooperating willingly with Derek's financial decisions. I needed evidence that proved Derek had misrepresented facts, concealed information, or acted beyond his legal authority in ways that constituted criminal behavior. The breakthrough came during a phone call Derek made while I was cleaning his study one afternoon in mid-December. He was speaking with someone about loan applications, discussing strategies for maximizing property valuations, and minimizing disclosure requirements about existing debt obligations. He mentioned specific techniques for presenting financial information in ways that would satisfy underwriting requirements without revealing the full scope of his borrowing against the same collateral. Most damaging of all, Derek discussed Sarah's role in these transactions with casual dismissal of her understanding or consent. He described her as a, quote, compliant co-signer who trusted his business judgment completely and signed documents without detailed review. He laughed about her lack of interest in financial details, saying it made complex transactions much simpler to execute without lengthy explanations or negotiations. This conversation revealed that Derek wasn't just borrowing against my house with Sarah's knowledge. He was actively concealing the scope and purpose of these loans, presenting each transaction as an isolated refinancing or improvement loan, rather than part of a larger pattern of asset stripping. Sarah was signing documents without understanding their cumulative impact, and Derek was deliberately maintaining her ignorance to facilitate his fraud. I recorded that conversation using a small digital device I'd purchased during one of my approved shopping trips, hiding the recorder among cleaning supplies while I worked in Derek's study. The recording provided clear evidence of fraudulent intent and deliberate deception that would be difficult for Derek to explain away as misunderstanding or miscommunication. Over the following weeks, I collected additional evidence of Derek's criminal activities while continuing to perform my household duties with the same attention to detail he demanded. The cognitive dissonance of serving dinner to a man I was simultaneously building a criminal case against was emotionally exhausting. But it also provided motivation to maintain my cover until I had enough evidence to ensure his complete downfall. By New Year's Eve, as Derek and Sarah prepared to host another elegant party in my grandmother's dining room, I had assembled a comprehensive file of evidence documenting multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Derek's arrogance and assumption of my harmlessness had led him to commit crimes in front of the very person who was most motivated to expose him, and most qualified to understand the legal implications of his actions. The new year would bring justice for Derek's victims and restoration of my family's legacy. But first, I had one more party to serve. One more evening of watching my daughter's husband play Lord of the Manor in the house my great-grandmother had built, with her own determined hands. This time, however, I would be serving more than just dinner. I would be serving justice, one documented crime at a time. January brought an unexpected ally in the form of Dr. Patricia Chen, the new cardiologist Sarah had started seeing for irregular heartbeat episodes that had begun appearing shortly after her marriage. Dr. Chen made house calls for follow-up appointments, a service that Derek had specifically requested to accommodate Sarah's busy social schedule and his preference for maintaining privacy about family medical matters. During Dr. Chen's third visit to the house, I was serving tea in the living room when she made an observation that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Sarah had excused herself to take a phone call from her wedding planner about anniversary party arrangements, leaving Dr. Chen and me alone for several minutes. The doctor studied me with the careful attention medical professionals develop for reading people beyond their stated symptoms. "Mrs. Campbell," she said quietly, using my married name rather than the Marie that Derek insisted all service providers use when addressing me. "I've been treating patients in this community for 15 years, and I remember when you were president of the hospital auxiliary. You organized the fundraiser that paid for the new cardiac wing where I work." The recognition hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Chen had been a young resident when I'd chaired the committee that raised $2 million for hospital improvements. Back when my name appeared on donor recognition plaques and my opinions were sought by community leaders. She remembered me as someone who commanded respect and wielded influence, not as household staff serving tea to my daughter's guests. "I'm concerned about some changes I've observed in this household," Dr. Chen continued, glancing toward the doorway where Sarah had disappeared. "Your daughter's stress levels are elevated beyond what I'd expect from normal life transitions. Her blood pressure readings suggest ongoing anxiety, and she's mentioned sleep disturbances that seem related to household management pressures." Dr. Chen paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've also noticed that you seem to have assumed responsibilities that might be contributing to family stress patterns." Sometimes when family dynamics shift dramatically, it can create health issues for everyone involved, particularly when those changes involve financial strain or power imbalances. Her professional language was careful and diplomatic, but the underlying message was clear. Dr. Chen had recognized that something was fundamentally wrong with my living situation, and she was offering to help without directly accusing Derek of elder abuse or manipulation. As a mandated reporter, she was probably considering whether my circumstances constituted a situation requiring official intervention. I thanked Dr. Chen for her concern and assured her that I was managing my responsibilities well, but I could see the skepticism in her expression. She left her business card on the kitchen counter after Sarah returned, mentioning that she was always available for family consultations about stress management and household health concerns. The card included her personal cell phone number, written in blue ink on the back. That evening, Derek questioned me extensively about my conversation with Dr. Chen, demanding to know exactly what had been discussed during Sarah's absence. His concerns seemed disproportionate to a casual medical appointment, suggesting that he understood the potential implications of outside scrutiny from healthcare professionals who might recognize signs of elder abuse or financial exploitation. When I assured him that Dr. Chen had simply been making polite conversation about community connections, Derek's relief was visible, but his suspicion remained elevated. He mentioned that he preferred family medical matters to remain private, and that he'd be scheduling future appointments at Dr. Chen's office, rather than continuing house calls. He also suggested that I should avoid unnecessary conversation with visiting professionals, focusing instead on my household duties while guests were present. The restriction on speaking with visitors was a new level of control that confirmed my growing understanding of Derek's systematic approach to isolation and manipulation. He was recognizing that my interaction with people who remembered my previous status in the community posed a threat to his carefully constructed narrative about family roles and household arrangements. Dr. Chen's visit had also revealed something important about Sarah's physical and emotional state. The stress symptoms her doctor had mentioned were news to me, since Sarah had been maintaining a facade of perfect contentment with her new married life. The revelation that she was experiencing health problems related to household pressures suggested that Derek's control was taking a toll on both of us, albeit in different ways. I began paying closer attention to Sarah's behavior and discovered signs of strain that I'd previously missed or misinterpreted. She was losing weight despite elaborate dinner preparations, had developed a nervous habit of checking and rechecking household details, and seemed increasingly anxious about Derek's approval of her appearance and social performance. The confident young woman I'd raised was disappearing beneath layers of self-doubt and compulsive perfectionism. Sarah had also begun taking medication for anxiety, something I discovered while organizing their bathroom cabinet during weekly cleaning. The prescription bottles revealed a pattern of increasing dosages and additional medications for sleep disturbances, all prescribed by doctors Derek had selected and appointments he'd arranged. Her medical care had become another area where Derek exerted control, managing her healthcare decisions and limiting her exposure to medical professionals who might ask uncomfortable questions. The prescription information provided another piece of evidence for the file I was building against Derek. The medication suggested that Sarah was experiencing significant psychological distress, which could support arguments about undue influence and mental manipulation if legal proceedings became necessary. More importantly, it confirmed that Derek's control was causing measurable harm to my daughter's health and well-being. Meanwhile, Derek's business activities were becoming increasingly desperate and risky. Phone conversations I overheard while cleaning his study revealed mounting pressure from creditors and business partners who were questioning his ability to deliver on promised investments. He was juggling multiple loan applications against the house, each requiring documentation and appraisals that created paperwork trails I could access during my cleaning duties. One particularly revealing conversation involved Derek discussing strategies for managing conflicting loan applications with someone he called his financial advisor. They were coordinating timing to prevent different lenders from discovering existing liens against the property, using techniques that clearly constituted fraud but were discussed with casual professionalism that suggested long experience with such schemes. Derek was also exploring options for pressuring Sarah to sign additional documents that would expand his authority over property decisions. He mentioned consulting with attorneys about creating power of attorney arrangements that would allow him to handle all real estate transactions without requiring Sarah's direct involvement in future deals. The conversation revealed his intention to completely eliminate Sarah's legal protections while maintaining the appearance of proper consent and authorization. These developments convinced me that Derek's timeline for asset stripping was accelerating, probably due to external pressures from failed business ventures or creditor demands. He was moving beyond gradual exploitation toward aggressive liquidation of property value, suggesting that my window for intervention was closing rapidly. I scheduled a meeting with Robert Martinez, the attorney Dr. Chen had recommended when I'd called her number seeking guidance about my situation. Mr. Martinez specialized in elder law and financial crimes, with particular experience in cases involving family members who exploited older relatives through legal manipulation and economic coercion. The initial consultation took place at his office on a Tuesday morning when Derek believed I was attending a medical appointment for routine testing. Mr. Martinez reviewed the evidence I'd collected, including recorded conversations, photographed documents, and detailed timelines of Derek's activities since moving into my house. His assessment was both encouraging and sobering. The evidence clearly supported charges of elder abuse, financial fraud, and possibly racketeering if Derek's pattern of targeting older women could be proven across multiple cases. However, prosecuting the case would require Sarah's cooperation, since she was the legal owner of the property and had signed documents authorizing many of Derek's actions. Mr. Martinez explained that Derek had structured his scheme carefully to maintain plausible deniability about criminal intent. Sarah's signatures on loan documents would complicate fraud charges, even if she'd been misled about their purpose or implications. Proving that Derek had acted beyond his authority would require demonstrating that he'd deliberately concealed information or forged signatures on specific transactions. The attorney recommended a two-phase approach to building the strongest possible case. First, we needed additional evidence of Derek's criminal activities, particularly documentation of current fraud attempts that could be prevented and prosecuted simultaneously. Second, we needed to document the impact of Derek's actions on both Sarah and me, establishing a pattern of psychological manipulation and financial harm that supported broader charges of conspiracy and racketeering. Mr. Martinez also suggested involving law enforcement proactively rather than waiting for Derek to complete his current schemes. If police could document ongoing criminal activity, they could obtain warrants for comprehensive investigation of Derek's business records and communication history. This approach would provide access to evidence beyond what I could gather through household surveillance. The meeting concluded with a plan for expanded evidence collection and preparation for coordinated legal action within the next 30 days. Mr. Martinez would research Derek's background for evidence of previous fraud cases, while I continued documenting his current activities. We would maintain regular contact through secured communication methods that would prevent Derek from discovering our collaboration. Returning home from the attorney meeting, I felt simultaneously hopeful and terrified about the next phase of my plan. Derek's control over my daily life remained absolute, and any mistake in maintaining my cover could result in immediate eviction or worse retaliation. But I also knew that doing nothing would guarantee the loss of my family's home and possibly Sarah's financial ruin as well. The evidence collection intensified over the following weeks as Derek's business activities reached a crescendo of desperate deal-making and fraudulent applications. He was simultaneously pursuing 3 different loan proposals against the house, each requiring different valuations and documentation that revealed the scope of his financial manipulation. The most promising source of evidence proved to be Derek's email communications, which I could access during computer cleaning sessions when he left his study temporarily. His correspondence revealed a network of associates involved in similar schemes, with detailed discussions about techniques for exploiting property owners and avoiding legal detection. The emails also contained specific references to my situation, describing me as a managed asset whose cooperation had been secured through appropriate incentives. Derek's communications about Sarah were particularly damaging, revealing his complete contempt for her intelligence and his strategic approach to maintaining control over her decisions. He described her as emotionally manageable, and praised his own skill in creating dependency and compliance through graduated pressure techniques. The emails provided clear evidence of deliberate psychological manipulation designed to prevent Sarah from questioning his authority or seeking independent advice. Most crucially, Derek's correspondence revealed his timeline for completing the asset stripping process. He was planning to execute the final loan transactions in early March, using the borrowed funds to invest in a commercial development project that would either generate enormous profits or result in complete financial collapse. Either outcome would serve his purposes, since success would provide capital for the next scheme, while failure would force sale of my house to satisfy creditor demands. The March deadline meant that Derek intended to destroy my family's legacy within 60 days of my discovery of his plans. The knowledge that time was running short intensified my determination to act decisively, but it also created pressure to move carefully enough to avoid detection while building an ironclad case for criminal prosecution. February brought an unexpected complication when Sarah announced that she was pregnant. The news came during a family dinner that Derek had orchestrated as a celebration of their upcoming anniversary, complete with champagne and formal table settings in my grandmother's dining room. Sarah's joy was unmistakable as she shared the news that they were expecting their first child in early September. Derek's response to the pregnancy announcement was perfectly calibrated to reinforce his image as devoted husband and future father. He showered Sarah with attention and immediately began making plans for converting one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery. He talked enthusiastically about the importance of providing their child with the stability and security that came from growing up in a historic family home. But Derek's private communications about the pregnancy told a different story entirely. In phone conversations I overheard while cleaning upstairs, he discussed the pregnancy as a strategic advantage that would complicate any legal challenges to his authority over property decisions. He mentioned that pregnant women were often viewed more sympathetically by courts, and that Sarah's condition would make it difficult for anyone to argue that he was acting against family interests. The pregnancy also provided Derek with new leverage for controlling Sarah's behavior and limiting her exposure to outside influences who might question his business decisions. He began restricting her activities for supposed health reasons, discouraging visits from old friends and family members who might notice changes in her situation or ask uncomfortable questions about household arrangements. Most disturbing of all, Derek's conversations revealed that he viewed the pregnancy as a deadline for completing his financial schemes before the baby's arrival complicated his plans for property liquidation. He was accelerating loan applications and business deals with the explicit goal of maximizing extracted value before family obligations required maintaining stable housing arrangements. The knowledge that Derek was using my daughter's pregnancy as cover for stealing her inheritance filled me with a rage that was difficult to control while maintaining my role as compliant household staff. He was not only destroying my family's legacy, but ensuring that his own child would inherit nothing but debt and legal problems from his fraudulent activities. Sarah's pregnancy also created new urgency around my plans for exposing Derek's crimes. If I waited too long to act, the baby would become another victim of Derek's financial schemes, potentially losing the security and inheritance that should have been guaranteed by 4 generations of Campbell family ownership of the property. Mr. Martinez shared my concerns about Derek's accelerated timeline and recommended moving immediately to the second phase of our legal strategy. We would file criminal complaints with multiple agencies simultaneously, requesting immediate investigation and asset freezing orders that would prevent Derek from completing his planned transactions. The timing would be crucial, since Derek was clearly preparing to act within weeks rather than months. The decision to move forward with criminal charges required careful coordination with law enforcement agencies that had experience investigating complex financial crimes. Mr. Martinez arranged meetings with the district attorney's office, the State Banking Commission, and federal investigators who specialized in elder fraud and interstate financial schemes. Each agency required different types of evidence and documentation to support their investigation requirements. The district attorney's office focused on local crimes including forgery and theft by deception. The Banking Commission needed evidence of fraudulent loan applications and misrepresentation to financial institutions. Federal investigators were interested in the broader pattern of Derek's activities and potential violations of interstate commerce and banking regulations. Preparing evidence packages for multiple agencies while maintaining my cover as Derek's household servant required extraordinary care and planning. I had to coordinate document reproduction, audio transcription, and timeline preparation without access to normal office resources or technology support. Every aspect of the evidence compilation had to be completed during brief periods when Derek was away from the house or distracted by business activities. The most challenging aspect of evidence preparation was creating comprehensive documentation of Derek's impact on both Sarah and me without access to medical records or financial statements that were controlled by Derek himself. Mr. Martinez helped by obtaining court orders for limited discovery that would allow law enforcement to access these documents during their investigation. By late February, we had assembled evidence packages that clearly demonstrated Derek's criminal activities and their impact on my family's welfare. The documentation included recorded conversations proving fraudulent intent, photographed documents showing forgery and misrepresentation, and detailed timelines establishing patterns of systematic exploitation. The evidence also included expert analysis of Derek's communication patterns and business activities, demonstrating that his treatment of my family was consistent with established schemes for targeting vulnerable older adults and their family members. This analysis would support broader charges related to conspiracy and racketeering if prosecutors decided to pursue maximum penalties. Mr. Martinez scheduled coordinated meetings with all relevant law enforcement agencies for the first week of March, timing the revelations to occur just before Derek's planned completion of his final loan transactions. The strategy was designed to catch Derek in the act of committing new crimes, while providing authorities with comprehensive evidence of his historical pattern of fraud and manipulation. The week before the scheduled law enforcement meetings, Derek's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling. He seemed to sense that his timeline was critical, pushing harder to complete business deals while tightening restrictions on both Sarah's and my activities. He hired a private security company to monitor the property, claiming that valuable real estate required professional protection against potential threats. The security measures were clearly designed to limit my access to outside communication and prevent unexpected visitors who might disrupt Derek's final preparations. He installed monitoring equipment throughout the house, including cameras in common areas and motion sensors that would alert him to any unusual activity during his absence. These new restrictions made evidence collection much more dangerous, but they also provided additional proof of Derek's consciousness of guilt and his awareness that his activities might be subject to investigation. The monitoring equipment itself became evidence of his systematic approach to controlling and surveilling family members. As March approached and the countdown to Derek's final schemes accelerated, I realized that the next few weeks would determine whether my family's four-generation legacy would survive or be destroyed by one man's greed and manipulation. The evidence was strong, the legal strategy was sound, and law enforcement was prepared to act. But Derek still held all the official power, and Sarah remained unaware of the danger threatening her inheritance and her unborn child's future. The battle for my family's survival was about to begin in earnest, and I was no longer fighting alone. But Derek had proven himself to be cunning, ruthless, and completely without conscience when it came to exploiting the people who trusted him. The final confrontation would test everything I'd learned about his methods and determine whether justice could prevail against systematic psychological and financial manipulation. Standing in my basement apartment on the last night of February, looking up at the house my great-grandmother had built with her own determined vision, I prepared for the most important fight of my life. Tomorrow, Derek would discover that the harmless old woman he'd been using as unpaid labor was actually a determined adversary who'd been documenting his crimes for months. The servant was about to become the prosecutor, and Derek Whitman was about to learn that stealing from the Campbell family women had consequences he'd never anticipated when he'd first smiled his way into my daughter's heart and my family's home. The morning of March 3rd began like any other day in my carefully orchestrated double life as Derek's servant and secret adversary. I prepared his Colombian coffee at precisely 5:30, delivered Sarah's breakfast tray at 7:15, and began my daily cleaning routine with the same attention to detail he'd demanded for months. But today was different because by noon, Derek's world would begin collapsing around him with a precision that matched his own methodical destruction of my family's security. Mr. Martinez had coordinated the timing with military precision. At 8:30 that morning, while Derek was conducting a conference call with potential investors about his final property development scheme. Federal agents were reviewing our evidence packages and preparing search warrants for his business records. At 9:15, while Sarah was at her prenatal appointment with Dr. Chen, banking investigators were cross-referencing Derek's loan applications against our documented evidence of fraudulent statements and forged signatures. I maintained my normal routine throughout the morning, dusting Derek's study while he finalized documents for what he believed would be his triumphant completion of the asset stripping process. He was expecting loan approval by afternoon and had already arranged to celebrate with an expensive dinner at the country club, where he'd been networking with other real estate developers. The irony of his confident anticipation while law enforcement prepared to destroy him was almost too perfect to believe. At 10:45, Derek received the first indication that his carefully constructed schemes were unraveling. The call came from his primary banking contact, informing him that his loan application had been flagged for additional review by federal investigators. Derek's initial response was confident irritation, assuming the delay was routine bureaucratic procedure that could be resolved through his usual combination of charm and aggressive negotiation. But as Derek made follow-up calls to other financial institutions involved in his various schemes, the pattern of sudden scrutiny became impossible to ignore. Every loan application was being reviewed, every document was being questioned, and every business reference was being contacted for verification of information Derek had provided. His network of fraudulent applications was being systematically dismantled by investigators who clearly possessed detailed knowledge of his activities. Derek's phone conversations during the late morning revealed his growing panic, as he realized that someone had provided law enforcement with comprehensive information about his business dealings. He began calling associates and demanding to know whether anyone had been contacted by investigators, whether any documents had been subpoenaed, and whether any former business partners might be cooperating with authorities. The desperation in Derek's voice as he tried to contain what he was beginning to understand was a coordinated investigation provided me with deep satisfaction after months of serving him while secretly documenting his crimes. He was experiencing the same sense of powerlessness and loss of control that he'd systematically imposed on both Sarah and me through his psychological manipulation and financial coercion. By 11:30, Derek had canceled his celebration dinner and was frantically reviewing documents in his study, trying to identify potential sources of the leaked information that had clearly reached law enforcement. He suspected business associates, former partners, or possibly disgruntled employees from previous schemes, but never considered that his own household servant might be the source of his destruction. At precisely noon, the coordinated law enforcement action began with a knock on the front door that would forever change the dynamics of power in my family's historic home. Two federal agents, accompanied by a local detective and a representative from the district attorney's office, presented Derek with search warrants for the house, his business records, and his personal financial documents. I was organizing the linen closet when Derek called out for me to answer the door, assuming that whatever visitors had arrived could be handled through normal social pleasantries. His shock when I opened the door to reveal law enforcement officers with legal documents was visible from across the foyer, transforming his confident demeanor into obvious confusion and growing alarm. The lead federal agent, Special Agent Catherine Rodriguez, introduced herself and her colleagues before presenting Derek with multiple warrants authorizing comprehensive search of the premises and seizure of documents related to real estate fraud, elder abuse, and interstate financial crimes. Derek's attempts to question the legal authority for the search were met with professional courtesy and absolute determination to proceed with the investigation. Agent Rodriguez explained that the search would be conducted systematically and respectfully, but that Derek was required to cooperate fully and provide access to all areas of the house and property. She also informed him that he was being investigated for multiple felonies and advised him of his right to contact an attorney before answering any questions about his business activities. Derek's first instinct was to call his lawyer, but the phone conversations I'd overheard during evidence collection had revealed that his primary legal counsel was also under investigation for assisting with fraudulent transactions. His backup attorney was unavailable for emergency consultation, leaving Derek to face the search without legal representation or advanced preparation for dealing with criminal investigators. As law enforcement officers spread throughout the house to begin their systematic evidence collection, Derek demanded to know the source of the information that had led to the investigation. Agent Rodriguez explained that they'd received comprehensive documentation of his criminal activities from multiple sources, including recordings of his own statements about fraudulent intent and photographed copies of forged documents. The revelation that investigators possessed recorded evidence of Derek's criminal planning caused visible deflation of his remaining confidence. He'd been so comfortable with his complete control over household activities that he'd never considered the possibility that someone might be documenting his private conversations and business communications. Sarah returned from her prenatal appointment to find her home occupied by federal agents collecting boxes of documents from Derek's study and photographing evidence throughout the house. Her shock and confusion were heartbreaking to witness, as she struggled to understand why her husband was being investigated for crimes she'd never suspected and couldn't comprehend. Dr. Chen had accompanied Sarah home from the appointment, concerned about her elevated stress levels and wanting to ensure she had medical support during what appeared to be a family crisis. The doctor's presence proved invaluable as Sarah began experiencing panic symptoms that required immediate attention and professional monitoring. Derek's attempts to explain the investigation to Sarah were hampered by his own incomplete understanding of the evidence against him and his growing realization that the situation was far more serious than he'd initially assumed. He alternated between reassuring her that everything would be resolved quickly and demanding that she avoid making any statements to investigators without legal representation. Agent Rodriguez took me aside for private questioning, while other officers continued searching the house and cataloging evidence. She thanked me for my cooperation in providing the information that had made the investigation possible and explained that my testimony would be crucial for prosecuting Derek's crimes successfully. The agent's respectful treatment of me as a cooperative witness rather than a victim provided the first restoration of dignity I'd experienced since Derek had reduced me to servant status. Agent Rodriguez addressed me as Mrs. Campbell, asked for my perspective on Derek's activities, and treated my observations as valuable intelligence from someone who'd witnessed criminal behavior firsthand. During the questioning, I provided detailed information about Derek's daily routines, his business communications, and the specific threats he'd made regarding my housing situation if I didn't comply with his demands for unpaid domestic labor. Agent Rodriguez took careful notes and recorded my statement for use in building the criminal case against Derek. The search of Derek's study revealed evidence that exceeded even my comprehensive documentation of his criminal activities. Investigators discovered multiple sets of financial records, some showing accurate information about his debt obligations, and others containing false statements for loan applications. They found correspondence with associates involved in similar schemes, detailed plans for property liquidation, and records of previous victims who'd been exploited through identical methods. Most damaging of all, investigators found Derek's personal journal containing detailed accounts of his psychological manipulation techniques and strategic planning for controlling both Sarah and me. The journal entries provided clear evidence of criminal intent and demonstrated that Derek's treatment of my family was part of a calculated scheme rather than unfortunate misunderstandings or business decisions gone wrong. The journal revealed Derek's complete contempt for both Sarah and me, describing us in derogatory terms that left no doubt about his predatory intentions. He'd written extensively about techniques for maintaining control over targets and strategies for maximizing asset extraction, while minimizing legal risk. The entries provided prosecutors with undeniable proof of Derek's consciousness of guilt and his awareness that his activities constituted criminal behavior. As the search continued throughout the afternoon, Derek's attempts to maintain control over the situation became increasingly desperate and revealing. He tried to direct investigators away from certain areas of the house, claimed that some documents were protected by attorney-client privilege, and attempted to minimize the significance of evidence they were discovering. Derek's behavior during the search provided additional evidence of his criminal mindset and his understanding that investigators were uncovering proof of serious crimes. His nervous energy, contradictory explanations, and obvious attempts at misdirection were noted by experienced investigators who recognized signs of guilt and deception. The most dramatic moment of the search occurred when investigators discovered Derek's hidden safe behind a bookshelf in his study. The safe contained cash, jewelry, and documents that Derek had clearly intended to keep secret from both law enforcement and his family members. Among the contents were property deeds from previous victims, business records showing a pattern of fraud spanning multiple states, and correspondence with criminal associates involved in similar schemes. Sarah's reaction to the discovery of Derek's secret safe and its contents marked the beginning of her realization that her husband's criminal activities extended far beyond anything she'd imagined possible. The evidence of his involvement with other victims and his systematic approach to financial exploitation shattered her remaining faith in his character and their marriage. Dr. Chen remained with Sarah throughout the afternoon, monitoring her physical condition and providing emotional support as the scope of Derek's deception became clear. The doctor's presence ensured that Sarah received appropriate medical attention while also serving as a witness to Derek's behavior and statements during the investigation. By late afternoon, investigators had collected sufficient evidence to support multiple felony charges against Derek, including elder abuse, financial fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Agent Rodriguez explained that additional charges were likely as investigators reviewed the seized documents and followed up on evidence of Derek's criminal network. Derek was formally arrested at 4:30 that afternoon, handcuffed in the foyer of my family's historic home while Sarah watched in stunned silence from the living room doorway. The sight of my daughter's husband being led away in custody provided vindication for months of careful planning and evidence collection, but it also marked the beginning of a difficult recovery process for my traumatized family. Agent Rodriguez remained after Derek's arrest to explain the next steps in the legal process and arrange for victim services support for both Sarah and me. She confirmed that the house would remain under our control during the investigation, since Derek's fraudulent loans would be challenged and likely dismissed as part of the criminal proceedings. The agent also explained that Derek's arrest was just the beginning of a broader investigation that would likely result in charges against his criminal associates and recovery of assets from previous victims. The scope of Derek's criminal network was larger than any of us had realized, involving multiple states and dozens of victims who'd been exploited through similar schemes. Sarah spent that evening in shocked silence, processing the reality that her marriage had been built on systematic deception and criminal exploitation of her family. The pregnancy made her emotional response even more intense, as she struggled with the knowledge that she was carrying the child of a man who'd shown complete contempt for her welfare and her family's legacy. Dr. Chen stayed with us that first night, monitoring Sarah's condition and providing professional guidance about managing the stress and trauma of discovering that her husband was a criminal predator. The doctor's presence also ensured that Sarah received appropriate medical care during a period when her physical health was vulnerable to the emotional shock she was experiencing. I spent the evening reviewing the events of the day and beginning to process the reality that Derek's control over my life had been permanently shattered. The house felt different without his oppressive presence, as if the building itself was exhaling after months of holding its breath under his tyrannical management. The next few days brought a steady stream of law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and legal professionals who needed information about Derek's activities and their impact on my family. Each interview and meeting provided additional confirmation that Derek's criminal behavior had been even more extensive and calculated than I'd realized during my months of secret investigation. Federal investigators revealed that Derek had been under surveillance for several months before my evidence package had provided the specific information needed to obtain search warrants and make arrests. My documentation had been crucial for understanding the psychological manipulation techniques Derek used, and for identifying the full scope of his asset-stripping activities. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Derek had been planning to abandon Sarah and disappear with the proceeds from his final loan transactions. He'd already established bank accounts in other states and had been making preparations for relocating to a jurisdiction where he could continue his criminal activities with reduced risk of prosecution. The knowledge that Derek had been planning to leave Sarah alone, pregnant, and financially ruined, added another layer of outrage to his already extensive criminal behavior. He'd shown complete disregard for the welfare of his own unborn child, while systematically destroying the financial security that should have provided for the baby's future. Media coverage of Derek's arrest began appearing within days, focusing initially on the financial fraud aspects of his crimes, but gradually expanding to include the elder abuse and psychological manipulation charges. The publicity brought additional victims forward, confirming that Derek's exploitation of my family was part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior. The house began returning to normal as Sarah and I worked together to restore spaces that Derek had controlled and restricted during his residence. We converted his study back into the library it had been during my grandmother's time, removing all traces of his business activities and replacing them with family photographs and heirloom furniture. Sarah's pregnancy progressed normally, despite the stress of Derek's arrest and the ongoing legal proceedings. Dr. Chen continued providing medical care while also serving as an informal counselor who helped Sarah process the trauma of discovering her husband's true nature. The doctor's support was invaluable during a period when Sarah needed both medical attention and emotional guidance. The basement apartment was restored to its original purpose as storage space, symbolically ending the period when I'd been reduced to servant status in my own home. Moving my belongings back to the master bedroom felt like reclaiming not just physical space but also my identity and dignity. After months of systematic humiliation, legal proceedings against Derek moved forward with remarkable efficiency, aided by the comprehensive evidence package we'd provided and the cooperation of other victims who came forward after his arrest. Prosecutors were confident about securing convictions on multiple felony charges that would result in substantial prison time and financial restitution. The civil aspects of Derek's crimes were equally important for restoring my family's financial security. His fraudulent loans were being challenged and dismissed, clearing the property of illegitimate debt obligations he'd created. Asset recovery efforts were also underway to reclaim money and property Derek had stolen from his various victims. Mr. Martinez continued representing my interests throughout the legal proceedings, ensuring that both criminal prosecution and civil recovery efforts protected my family's rights and financial welfare. His expertise in elder fraud cases proved invaluable for navigating the complex legal issues created by Derek's systematic exploitation. As March progressed and spring began returning to the gardens my family had tended for 4 generations, I felt hope returning to my life for the first time since Derek had entered our world with his charming smile and predatory intentions. The house was ours again, Sarah was receiving appropriate support for her pregnancy, and Derek was facing justice for his crimes. The investigation had also revealed the full scope of Derek's criminal network, leading to arrests of associates who'd been involved in similar schemes across multiple states. The coordinated law enforcement action dismantled an entire organization that had been exploiting vulnerable older adults and their families through sophisticated psychological manipulation and financial fraud. Standing in my restored garden on a warm afternoon in late March, watching Sarah plan the nursery for her baby while Derek awaited trial in federal custody, I reflected on the journey from victimization to vindication that had consumed the past year of my life. The battle had been won, but the war for my family's future was just beginning with the knowledge that we could survive and overcome even the most systematic attempts at destruction. Derek's trial began on a crisp October morning, exactly 7 months after his arrest, and 1 month after Sarah gave birth to Emma Catherine Campbell, named for my grandmother, who had built the house where 4 generations of our family had found refuge and strength. The timing felt symbolic, as if the universe was ensuring that new life would emerge from the ashes of Derek's destruction, just as justice was finally being served. Sarah had insisted on attending the trial despite her recent delivery and the exhaustion that comes with caring for a newborn. Dr. Chen had cleared her for limited courthouse appearances, provided she remained in the back of the courtroom and left immediately if she experienced any physical distress. Sarah wanted to face Derek one final time, to look him in the eye while prosecutors detailed the systematic way he'd manipulated and exploited our family. The federal courthouse in downtown was packed with media representatives, law enforcement officials, and family members of Derek's various victims who had traveled from across 3 states to witness his prosecution. The scope of Derek's criminal network had expanded far beyond what any of us had initially realized, encompassing over 30 victims in financial losses exceeding $12 million. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh opened the prosecution with a devastating summary of Derek's predatory behavior that began with his targeting methodology and ended with his planned abandonment of Sarah and their unborn child. She described him as a sophisticated criminal who had refined his techniques over years of practice, using psychological manipulation and legal exploitation to destroy families while enriching himself through their suffering. The evidence presentation lasted 3 days and included recorded conversations, financial documents, victim testimony, and expert analysis of Derek's manipulation techniques. The recordings I had made while serving as his unwitting household staff proved particularly damaging, as they captured Derek's own words describing his victims in contemptuous terms and planning their continued exploitation. Derek's defense attorney attempted to portray him as a legitimate businessman whose ventures had unfortunately failed, leaving him unable to repay loans and investments that had been made in good faith. The strategy required arguing that Derek had never intended to defraud anyone and that his treatment of Sarah and me reflected cultural misunderstandings rather than deliberate criminal behavior. The defense strategy collapsed completely when prosecutors played recordings of Derek discussing his asset harvesting techniques and describing how he maintained control over target families through graduated psychological pressure. His own words demolished any possibility of claiming innocent intent or cultural miscommunication as explanations for his systematic exploitation. My testimony on the 4th day of trial provided the court with detailed accounts of Derek's daily manipulation tactics and their impact on both my dignity and Sarah's well-being. Speaking publicly about the humiliation of being reduced to servant status in my own home was emotionally difficult, but necessary for ensuring that Derek faced appropriate consequences for his psychological cruelty. The prosecutor guided me through a chronological account of Derek's escalating control, from the initial property transfer through the household management schedule, and finally to the threats of eviction if I refused to comply with his demands for unpaid domestic labor. The courtroom was silent as I described the systematic way Derek had stripped away my identity and independence. Sarah's testimony was brief but powerful, focusing on Derek's deception about his financial situation and her growing realization that their entire marriage had been built on lies designed to exploit her inheritance. She spoke clearly and calmly about the psychological impact of discovering that the man she'd trusted with her future had viewed her as nothing more than a pathway to her family's property. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when prosecutors presented evidence from Derek's personal journal, reading aloud entries where he described Sarah as malleable target material and me as elderly asset guardian requiring management. The clinical coldness of his language revealed a complete absence of human empathy and confirmed that every moment of apparent kindness had been calculated manipulation. Derek's journal also contained detailed analysis of our psychological vulnerabilities and strategic plans for exploiting them. He'd written extensively about Sarah's desire to please and her fear of confrontation, noting how these traits could be used to secure her cooperation with financial decisions she didn't fully understand. His assessment of my dedication to family welfare had led him to correctly predict that I would accept servant status rather than risk homelessness. The prosecution's expert witness, Dr. Michael Harrison, a forensic psychologist specializing in financial predators, explained Derek's behavior patterns to the jury in terms that highlighted the sophisticated nature of his criminal enterprise. Dr. Harrison described Derek as a classic example of a predatory personality who viewed other human beings as resources to be exploited, rather than individuals deserving of respect and consideration. Derek's cross-examination was a disaster for the defense, as he proved unable to explain his recorded statements about fraudulent intent without either admitting criminal behavior or claiming memory lapses that appeared obviously fabricated. His attempts to justify his treatment of Sarah and me came across as arrogant and unrepentant, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that he posed a continuing danger to society. The defense's character witnesses were undermined by prosecution evidence showing that Derek had deceived them about his background and current circumstances. Several witnesses admitted under cross-examination that they would not have provided supportive testimony if they had known about Derek's criminal activities and his systematic exploitation of vulnerable family members. Derek's sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks after the jury's guilty verdict on all counts, including elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy, and interstate transportation of stolen property. The federal guidelines called for substantial prison time, but the judge had discretion to consider the scope of Derek's crimes and their impact on his numerous victims. I submitted a victim impact statement that focused not on revenge, but on the importance of protecting other families from Derek's predatory behavior. I described the psychological damage caused by his systematic humiliation, and the way his exploitation had threatened to destroy a family legacy that had survived 4 generations of challenges and hardships. Sarah's victim impact statement was read by the prosecutor because she was home caring for baby Emma, who had been born with minor health complications that required constant attention. Sarah's statement emphasized her concern for other young women who might become targets for Derek's manipulation, particularly those who inherited property or had access to family wealth. Judge Patricia Hendricks delivered a sentence that reflected both the severity of Derek's crimes and her understanding of their impact on vulnerable victims. Derek received 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, with restrictions on his access to financial institutions and elderly individuals. The judge's sentencing statement included strong language about Derek's calculated cruelty and his complete lack of remorse for the psychological and financial damage he had inflicted on multiple families. She noted that his crimes had been particularly heinous because they had targeted the fundamental bonds of trust that hold families and communities together. Derek's criminal conviction triggered automatic review of all financial transactions he had conducted during his residence in my house, leading to complete reversal of his fraudulent loans and restoration of clear title to the property. The banking institutions that had been deceived by Derek's false documentation agreed to absorb their losses, rather than pursue claims against property that had been illegitimately pledged as collateral. The civil restitution process proved more complex, as Derek's criminal activities had left him with no legitimate assets that could be seized to compensate his victims. However, asset recovery specialists were able to trace money Derek had hidden in various accounts, ultimately recovering approximately 60% of the funds he had stolen from his various victims. My family's financial recovery was more complete than most victims experienced, primarily because Derek's residence in our house had been relatively brief, and because my early intervention had prevented him from completing his most ambitious asset-stripping schemes. The house remained ours with clear title, and the minor expenses we'd incurred during the legal proceedings were covered by victim compensation funds. More importantly, the prosecution had established legal precedents that would make it easier to prosecute similar cases in the future and protect other families from comparable exploitation. The comprehensive documentation of Derek's psychological manipulation techniques provided law enforcement and victim advocates with valuable tools for recognizing and addressing predatory behavior. Sarah's recovery from Derek's psychological manipulation proved to be a gradual process that required ongoing support from Dr. Chen, and a counselor who specialized in treating victims of domestic psychological abuse. Learning to trust her own judgment again after months of having her perceptions systematically undermined took time and professional guidance. The birth of Emma provided Sarah with new purpose and motivation for rebuilding her life independently. Motherhood gave her confidence that had been systematically eroded during her marriage to Derek, as she discovered her own competence in making decisions about her daughter's care and welfare without requiring anyone else's approval or guidance. Sarah returned to work part-time when Emma was 6 months old, accepting a marketing position with a nonprofit organization that assisted victims of financial crimes. Her personal experience with Derek's manipulation gave her unique insight into the psychological tactics used by financial predators and the recovery challenges faced by their victims. The house itself seemed to breathe easier after Derek's removal and conviction, as if the building itself had been holding its breath during his residence. We restored rooms to their original purposes, removed the monitoring equipment Derek had installed, and replaced furniture that held unpleasant associations with his controlling behavior. Emma's nursery was established in the bedroom that had been my mother's art studio, a space filled with natural light and peaceful energy that seemed perfect for raising the next generation of Campbell women. Sarah painted the walls herself in soft yellow and green, colors that complemented the garden view from the large windows that faced east toward the sunrise. The garden became a source of healing and renewal, as Sarah and I worked together to restore areas that had been neglected during the chaos of Derek's residence and the subsequent legal proceedings. We planted new rose bushes to replace ones that had died during the winter, expanded the herb garden that my grandmother had started, and created a play area where Emma could safely explore as she grew older. Our relationship as mother and daughter required rebuilding after the damage caused by Derek's systematic manipulation and the stress of living under his psychological control. We attended family counseling sessions with Dr. Martinez's wife, Dr. Carmen Martinez, who specialized in repairing family bonds that had been damaged by predatory individuals. The counseling process helped us understand how Derek had deliberately created conflict and misunderstanding between us as part of his strategy for maintaining control over family dynamics. We learned to recognize the difference between legitimate disagreements and manufactured discord designed to prevent us from supporting each other against external threats. Emma's presence in the house brought joy and laughter that had been missing during Derek's residence. Her infant needs provided structure and purpose to our days while also reminding us of the importance of protecting family bonds and creating a secure environment for the next generation. Dr. Chen continued monitoring Sarah's health throughout her recovery from Derek's psychological abuse, noting significant improvements in her stress levels, sleep patterns, and overall emotional stability as the trial concluded and normal family life resumed. The doctor observed that Sarah's confidence and decision-making abilities returned gradually as she experienced success in caring for Emma without interference or criticism. The broader investigation of Derek's criminal network led to additional prosecutions that dismantled an entire organization of predatory individuals who had been targeting vulnerable older adults across multiple states. The coordinated law enforcement effort resulted in over 40 arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets. Several of Derek's former victims contacted us during and after the trial, expressing gratitude for our willingness to pursue prosecution despite the personal costs involved. Many of them had been too intimidated or exhausted to seek justice on their own, and our successful case provided them with hope and practical guidance for their own recovery efforts. The media coverage of Derek's prosecution raised public awareness about the sophistication of modern financial predators and the vulnerability of families to manipulation by individuals who gain access through romantic relationships. Several news outlets featured our story as an example of how victims could fight back against systematic exploitation through careful documentation and cooperation with law enforcement. Mr. Martinez continued representing other victims of Derek's network pro bono, using the legal precedents established in our case to pursue justice for families who had been similarly exploited. His work helped establish new protocols for investigating and prosecuting complex financial fraud cases that involved psychological manipulation and family exploitation. The house required extensive maintenance and updating after Derek's departure, but the work provided therapeutic value as Sarah and I reclaimed spaces that had been controlled by his oppressive presence. We refinished hardwood floors, updated the kitchen with modern appliances while preserving its historical character, and restored the original color schemes that reflected our family's aesthetic preferences. Emma's first Christmas was celebrated in the restored dining room where 4 generations of Campbell women had gathered for holiday meals. The table was set with my grandmother's china, the tree was decorated with ornaments collected over decades of family celebrations, and the house felt complete again with 3 generations living together in harmony. Sarah's confidence as a mother grew steadily throughout Emma's first year, and her success in caring for her daughter independently helped rebuild the self-trust that Derek had systematically undermined during their marriage. She made decisions about Emma's care, medical needs, and daily routine without seeking external validation or approval. The financial security provided by Derek's conviction and the restoration of clear property title allowed us to plan for Emma's future with confidence. We established education funds, updated insurance policies, and created legal documents that would protect the family property from future exploitation attempts. On Emma's first birthday, we hosted a garden party for friends and family members who had supported us throughout the ordeal with Derek's prosecution and our subsequent recovery. The celebration took place on the same lawn where Sarah's wedding had been held 3 years earlier, but the atmosphere was completely different, filled with genuine joy and authentic relationships rather than Derek's calculated social manipulation. Dr. Chen attended Emma's birthday party and observed the dramatic transformation in both Sarah's demeanor and my own recovery from the psychological trauma of Derek's exploitation. She noted that our family had not only survived Derek's predatory behavior, but had emerged stronger and more unified than before his destructive intervention. The legal case against Derek became a model for prosecuting similar crimes, and law enforcement agencies began using our documentation methods as training examples for investigating financial exploitation of elderly individuals and their families. The comprehensive evidence package we had assembled provided a template for building strong cases against sophisticated predators. 3 years after Derek's conviction, Sarah met James Morrison, a teacher at Emma's daycare center, who demonstrated genuine kindness and respect for both Sarah and her daughter. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, with careful attention to ensuring that Emma felt secure and that family bonds remained the primary consideration in all decisions. James's approach to our family was completely different from Derek's predatory methodology. He expressed interest in our family's history, respected the house's significance to our heritage, and never suggested changes or improvements that would serve his own interests. Most importantly, he treated me as a valued family member, rather than an obstacle to be managed or controlled. The contrast between James's authentic character and Derek's manipulative behavior helped Sarah recognize the difference between genuine love and calculated exploitation. Their eventual engagement was celebrated as a union based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than one person's systematic manipulation of another's vulnerabilities. Emma's childhood unfolded in the security of her ancestral home, surrounded by family members who had learned valuable lessons about protecting what matters most from those who would exploit trust and kindness for personal gain. She grew up hearing stories about her great-great-grandmother, who had built the house, and about the importance of standing firm against those who would steal family legacies. The house continues to stand as a symbol of resilience and determination, having survived not only the physical challenges of age and weather, but also the psychological assault of Derek's systematic exploitation. Each room holds memories of struggle and victory, of family bonds tested and strengthened through adversity. Standing in my garden on warm summer evenings, watching Sarah and James play with Emma, while the sun sets behind the trees my grandfather planted, I reflect on the journey from victimization to vindication that defined my 7th decade of life. Derek's attempt to destroy my family's legacy ultimately strengthened our bonds and taught us lessons about courage, persistence, and the power of careful documentation when fighting sophisticated predators. The servant quarters in the basement remain empty, a reminder of how close we came to losing everything to someone who mistook kindness for weakness and family loyalty for exploitable vulnerability. But they also represent the foundation of our victory, the place where I planned Derek's downfall, while he believed he had reduced me to harmless domestic help. Emma will inherit not just the house and property that 5 generations of Campbell women have preserved, but also the knowledge that no predator, however sophisticated or charming, can ultimately triumph over determined resistance and careful preparation. The legacy Derek tried to steal has been preserved and strengthened for the future, protected by legal precedents and family wisdom earned through surviving his systematic assault on our dignity and security. Justice was served not just through Derek's conviction and imprisonment, but through the restoration of our family's peace and the protection of countless other families who will benefit from the legal tools and awareness his prosecution created. Sometimes the greatest victory comes not from revenge, but from ensuring that evil cannot triumph again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.